So today I want to give you a brief overview of the larger historical context that gave way to May 68, which stands as a single noun nowadays. Now, Europe's revival, economic and political, in fact accelerated throughout the 1950s. To give you an example, the French economy doubled in the 1950s and almost tripled in the 60s. And in fact, in all of Western Europe, the per capita rate of growth exceeded that of the United States between 1952 and 1980. Now, how does this happen? We don't have time to go over it, but I want you to know about three general principles. First of all, a commitment to a mixed economy, because politicians and economists had drawn two important conclusions from the disastrous depression of the 1930s. The catastrophe that unfolded after the 1929 economic crash had largely been due to the breakdown of the global trading and financial system and the fragmentation of the world that followed. But it also had been due to the failure of unrestricted free markets. And free markets had led to inflation, and this economic disaster had led to fascism. So the conclusion was simple. The market would have to be supplemented by public planning and macroeconomic management. And never again would the market economy be unregulated. So we call this a mixed economy because it is still the free market, but the state intervenes to regulate and to ensure that most will not suffer unduly from it. So the 50s and 60s saw a twofold change. First, governments were committed to their responsibility to maintain full employment. Second, they believed that in order to recover, one needed to expand the public sector as well as government control over central banks in order to be able to adopt counter-cyclical measures. The idea was that government intervention would restrict the free play of the market in the interest of social stability, peace, and an adequate rate of economic growth. And part of that was income redistribution as a foundational cornerstone of economic recovery. And the story of the 3 decades after World War II confirmed that diagnosis. So what happened is we see the emergence of the welfare state. That is a new definition of prosperity. And the welfare state, in its European meaning, is very different than what Americans usually understand. This was based on the philosophy of John Maynard Keynes. What it meant is that governments assume that they had the obligation to undertake those tasks neglected by private enterprise, and if necessary, to intervene at key points in the economy to stimulate growth and provide essential services. These essential services included social programs such as welfare for the unemployed. If people have no income, they will not spend, they will not put back in the economy. Then state-funded education and state-funded medical care. This also had an effect on education, especially with a demographic explosion that unfolded in the wake of World War II. That is the emergence of what we call the baby boomer generation, those born at the end of World War II and in the 5 years after. So there was a commitment that education would be, if not free, at least accessible to all and available to all. In France, education became free. So universities were public. But by the time the French youth got into university, if you think about the mid-60s to late 60s, so 65 to 68, what they found is antiquated institutions that could not respond to the fact that there were now so many students. The university population tripled. For instance, a room that could welcome 400 students now had 1,000 students sitting there on the floor in order to step in. Additionally, these young students faced professors who seemed to be out of touch, who seemed to be of another era, who were authoritarian and hierarchical, and did not respond to the demand for new knowledge that was present. Now, if this is the context for France, there's another context that matters for the whole world as well as for France, and that is decolonization. So the late 50s and 60s is the era of decolonization. That is when former colonized people finally achieve the dream of liberation and independence. Now, we've seen how that could be difficult and involve conflict, as in the Algerian War. And decolonization was not always self-evident, but this certainly was the age of the end of empires. The end of empires in Asia. In 1947, India became independent along with Pakistan. We see as well the Korean War unfold, except for France that did not agree to free its colonies and was embroiled in a war, the Indochina War, until 1954, when it lost. In the Middle East too, Middle Eastern populations resisted attempts to reimpose colonial control after 1954, especially since it was British companies' interest to tighten their grip on oil. And the legacy of the Holocaust complicated this with the creation of the State of Israel in the afterwar. Now, Egypt finally became independent in 1956, and the same followed on the African continent. Ghana became independent in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1964, and of course, in 1962, Algeria. And one consequence that we'll examine later is that people from these former colonies started migrating to Europe. First, because they were invited by European governments to fill those labor shortages that were critical if Europe was to recover economically, and also labor shortage because of demographic losses of World War II. By 1980, 8% of the European population was foreign or foreign-born, as opposed to 6% on the whole American continent. Now, this fuels the emergence of May 68, an unforeseen event that results from a number of complicated factors that came together. Now, May 68 is really characterized by massive nationwide civil unrest. And keep in mind that while we look at France, it is something that took place throughout Europe and the world. In France, it lasted 7 weeks, between May 2nd and June 23rd, and it involved what had never been seen before, a coalition of students and workers. 9 to 11 million workers went on strike, on a general strike, and occupied factories. And they were joined by students who were demonstrating, who were building barricades and occupying universities, making demands. In those 7 weeks, France came to a halt. Now, what did these people demand? Well, workers demanded better working conditions, the recognition of their plight, and an expansion of this welfare state. And students were also politicized. The memory of the Algerian War did something to enable this politicization. But in general, students were critical of capitalism as well as consumerism. They were also shaped by their incredible critique of American imperialism, and the Vietnam War and American involvement weighed heavily on French students' political consciousness, especially since the efforts of the 1967 peace accords that were housed in Paris at that time. So there was definitely a utopian orientation to May 68 because there was a conviction that change was indeed possible and would happen. And in fact, that wasn't completely untrue. May 68 inaugurated the emergence of new social movements that will emerge and successfully change French society. And May 68 represents a cultural, social, and political turning point. As Julian Jackson named it, it was France's last revolution.